joining us on a Friday afternoon. This is turning out to be kind of traditional time for ARRCU meetings, but with some exceptions, as I'll note in a minute. The purpose of this meeting is to follow up on last year's open meeting on the initiative by Environment and Climate Change Canada entitled Climate Science 2050. And this is a major effort to engage a broad community inside and outside government and strategic planning. And our main focus for today will be Climate Science 2050. But as an ARRCU meeting, I'm hoping that there'll be lots of time as well for discussion and input. And indeed, this process has been quite very consultative. So I'm looking forward to hearing that discussion. So before I introduce our main speaker for today, I'd like to pass the spotlight to Hind Alabadla, who is the, oops, I've got a little problem. My slides here. There we go. Who's the vice chair of ARRCU. My name is Paul Kushner, by the way. I serve as chair of the special interest group on atmosphere-related research in Canadian universities. So I should have introduced myself a bit more properly. And so Hind is serving as our vice chair, and she'll be hosting an upcoming event. So Hind, why don't you just talk about that for a little bit?
Yes, thank you, Paul. Happy New Year, everyone, and good to see all of you today. This is a great attendance, and look forward to today's event and workshop. The next ARRCU event this year is going to be held in February, and it is a specialized, very targeted workshop towards knowledge mobilization. We are going to host Marjorie Shepherd again in February. She will give us the knowledge mobilization part of Climate Science 2050 that I think we'll talk about today as well. But in addition to that, I invited a number of speakers that cover academics, editors at journals that deal with scientists and publish policy briefs, reporters from the Chemical Institute of Canada and CBC. And also on the regulation side, I invited an environmental lawyer to be part of this workshop. So here is the QR code for the registration page. So please, try your best to attend. It's promising to be a very informative workshop, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Hind, and really appreciate your carrying the baton for that. It looks like a great event coming up. Okay, now I'd like to sort of get started on the main event, but just to quickly check, has Sean, did Sean text back, Marjorie? Okay, so he's going to
join us here.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks.
Oh, hey, Sean, great. Okay, good. All right, very good. So I wanted to kind of just get into the next thing. Sorry about the frozen slides here. I hope that's not a bad harbinger. All right. And introduce Marjorie Shepherd, who's serving as a senior climate change science advisor at Environment and Climate Change Canada. And she has a whole team here from ECCC involved in Climate Science 2050. So what I'm going to do is ask Marjorie to introduce herself and the team. You're better familiar with how you're going to handle this. And I just want to thank you for being available for this describing this initiative. And I really look forward to hearing from you today. So please go ahead, Marjorie, and I can advance the slides at your request.
Thank you very much, Paul. I appreciate that. In terms of a team, maybe I'll just sort of start with the role that Sean Marshall and I are playing. Between the two of us, we are kind of the scientific leadership for developing this National Climate Change Science Plan. And he and I will share delivery of the presentation this afternoon. I'm really fortunate to have a number of really good science policy analysts working with us in our group in Science and Technology branch. I know that Laura is online and some of her other colleagues may be. Nathan Gillett has been helping us lead the Earth System Climate Science theme under this National Science Plan. And I think actually it's just a few of us who are here today, Paul.
Okay.
So you can always reach out to any of us if you have questions about the plan or want to talk about any of the aspects further. So let's jump into the next slide, please. I had to check the calendar, and it's important to label all your files carefully in your directories. because when I went to draft this presentation, I looked in my files and saw it there already till I realized it was January 20th, 2021, which is the last time we did this.
Right, exactly.
So I created a new presentation. So to see if anything happened in the last 12 months. So a year ago, we published Climate Science 2050. It was a synthesis, a stock take of the broad range of science activities needed to inform ambitious climate action. It's intended to be a foundational science piece for both mitigation and adaptation. And right from the beginning, we wanted to create a construct in which the natural physical sciences, social sciences, and health sciences could all be part of the conversation to achieve that kind of transformational next generation Canada that is going to be net zero and resilient. We structured the report along 5 themes that you see there on the left in blue, and we're carrying forward that structure. We are endeavoring to hold to our guiding principles to be reflective of the diverse knowledge systems, offering opportunities for Indigenous organizations to contribute, and really raising the profile of knowledge synthesis and mobilization to the same level as the research activity itself, reflecting the importance of actually getting it into the hands of the users. We did not want to lose sight of the scientific infrastructure while we're busy talking about new work that needs to be done or strengthened. So we continue to seek, as we develop the science plan, information on where monitoring, observation, surveillance needs to be strengthened. Similarly, digital infrastructure, computing, data access, and ongoing implementation of open science principles. So I think we're on to the next slide, which is implementation. So that was a national synthesis, step 1, if you will. We did expect and still do expect that funding and implementation of this will happen by many people in many different ways. Our role at Environment and Climate Change Canada is really that of convening the conversation at the national scale. My office also does a lot of the federal climate change science coordination, and others in my office facilitate a lot of the international science leadership and participation, or at the very least have the opportunity to identify opportunities for that. So implementation in 3 broad areas for us includes developing a prioritized science plan, and that's what we'll get into today, which is really intended to identify those areas that need to really move over the next 5 to 10 years. And we anticipate updating this every 5 years. We want to have some discussion around looking at mechanisms and options for how this could be, should be, might be coordinated in Canada better. And there was also a request that we look at indicators to track and evaluate scientific progress. That actually hasn't started yet, but it does remain as something that some of our senior management is very interested in. How can you see that the science is happening? Next slide. So this science plan, the objectives are really pretty blunt. It's intended to guide national investments in the science and the research planning. We often heard that it's difficult to get funding for the science until you tell people what the science is going to do. So this is getting that planning out there to support asks. We are using it to build and nurture the science policy dialogue with all those involved in mitigation and adaptation policy and programming. We have really aligned it specifically to the new Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act and the emerging national adaptation strategy. It is seen as filling a gap. Other nations, international organizations have research plans, research strategies, research programs that focus on climate change at a national scale. We don't have that in Canada, and we're looking to build that piece with this effort and have that effort be sustained. And we are continually being reminded that this has to be an integrative, societally relevant exercise informing both mitigation and adaptation. Next slide. This was sort of expanded from the initial slide. These were principles that we developed in Climate Science 2050, and they've had a lot more pickup than I anticipated. It all seems like the right way to do science, but we have found that by being explicit about this, it's helping us do a better engagement process, be inclusive of some of the social sciences, and actually legitimately open up space for others we don't normally talk to from a natural science background. I think that's the key points from that slide. So So timeline. Right now, we're working on, engagement with academic, private sector experts, stakeholders, etc. And really the mechanisms for that are the science roundtables, meetings like this. We've just finished a targeted stakeholder survey, and there's also a fairly formal request for information that's come out to academic organizations. We'll be drafting it, getting it ready for a peer review, maybe more towards May, June than April. And then over the summer, we'll be getting into, doing a final consultation on that peer reviewed draft with an aim to release it this autumn. So a number of bureaucratic steps and hoops that we have to jump through, but from your perspective, a version should be coming out in that May, June timeframe for comment while we do the peer review. Next slide. So the structure of the science roundtables, we did have one for each of the major themes in Climate Science 2050, plus a new one, explicit theme on science communication and knowledge mobilization. The Earth System Climate Science one that Sean, Nathan, and myself led happened before Christmas, much thanks to some of you who were able to participate in that. Also before Christmas, we held one on resilient aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. The Healthy Canadian one is probably going to get pushed to late February or March. So an early shout out to my health colleagues who will be releasing their national climate change and health report, science assessment, probably at the very end of maybe into middle February, but that's coming out. Resilient communities is really a focus on infrastructure, built infrastructure, nature-based solutions, transportation, city infrastructure, defined broadly. That will be early February. We're working on a sector-based table around sustainable natural resources. So fisheries, ag, forestry, mining, and to some extent, energy. And then a piece on carbon neutral net zero, which we are still in the process of developing. Sean, that's all the bureaucratic background. Maybe this is a good place to hand it off.
Okay, thanks, Marjorie. So that would be next slide. So there's a lot of process still here that I'll do my best with. So Marjorie, chime in when I'm not representing it perfectly here. And just to say hello to everyone too to start, and Happy New Year. I'm happy to be here. This is really the merger of my two current communities with Environment and Climate Change Canada and the University ARRCU research community. Both are close to my heart. So within those climate science roundtables that Marjorie just introduced, the idea is to gather and hear from people around knowledge needs that have been partially created from the user stakeholder community and around the science activities that are needed to help address a lot of those knowledge needs. And I'll talk a bit more about some of those things, but there's just a huge amount of science need around climate science within the country and in various areas. And the lens that we'll be using for trying to integrate and develop priorities within those will be informed largely by the bolded words here, which is the overall aim of the National Climate Change Science Plan is to help address the science gaps and the science needs to inform climate change mitigation activities, so reduced emissions, carbon sinks, natural carbon sinks, and to inform climate resilience, so climate change impacts and adaptation programming. And so it needs to be relevant and responsive to those needs. And I'll say a bit more about that going forward. We've been kind of challenged a bit that these federal needs or national needs. And it's true that national adaptation strategy and net zero is very much coming out of legislation. It's national needs, but it's federal programs, but it's also a huge national need in terms of supporting climate change impacts and adaptation across the country and towards the drive to net zero, and what is the science that we need to inform that. There needs to be excellent science in terms of the priorities based on the people at this table and your assessment of that, and the international science lens in terms of where climate science is going and thinking ahead. It's called Climate Science 2050. This is kind of the 5-year plan, but it's stage 1 of a rolling 5-year plan that takes us to 2050. And we're also thinking about what science, what new activities would benefit. So not just where there's a gap, but what can really benefit from national coordination and collaboration. So where we maybe are really good at it right now, but we don't have the coordination or collaboration in place to actually, optimize that. Next slide, please. So and as Marjorie said, several of you were participants in the Earth System Climate Science Workshop that was held December 17th. So thanks for that. Nathan, who's on the call, really helped to drive and moderate these two. And so after I'm done, I'm going to invite Nathan for input on things that I've maybe neglected or forgotten here. But this is really into the fine print. I'm not going to go over every single point on these next couple of slides, but we had a lot of knowledge needs that were identified by the user stakeholder community. So this might be the policy people, or in the case of Earth System Climate Science, a lot of it was the Canadian Centre for Climate Services and what they hear from their various clients, and working with groups like PKIC on what are the needs for infrastructure for communities. And so a lot of this is very granular, it's very detailed. But then we're just trying to think about those and think of what is it. It is a large scale need for the country, and what kind of science activities can help to support that. And we've organized those into 5 main themes. These are the first one, kind of carbon cycle science. And so within that, what we heard, these are just early messages from those roundtables, as Marjorie mentioned. We've gotten back 2 days ago a 54-page report from the workshop, the roundtable facilitators. And so we really are just early stages of parsing through that and trying to synthesize that. But a lot of these bullets here were themes that were discussed and had some traction amongst a lot of the participants in those roundtables as important knowledge needs. I wouldn't call them priorities, there's too many of them to be identified as priorities, but around carbon cycle science, it's understanding of some of the natural carbon sinks and better modeling systems to address those things, from things like permafrost, carbon emissions, not listed here, but came up a lot in the discussions where ocean and actually freshwater carbon cycle processes as well, wildfire. So just towards monitoring and modeling of those natural kind of landscape scale, national scale carbon fluxes, reconciliation of top-down, bottom-up approaches. So that's towards observations, whether it's atmospheric or remote sensing based inferences of greenhouse gas fluxes versus the kind of the modeling, which is done within national inventory reports, or a lot of the economic analyses that's kind of sector based. And so there's, yeah, again, I promise not to go through every single bullet because we would take all the time, and we're more interested just to go into the feedback and conversation mode. But you can see in these, and you've got access to these slides, you can work through them and get some sense of the things we were talking about at the roundtable. The second bullet in bold, it lost the word extremes, but this should be meteorological, climate, and hydrological extremes. And this was kind of a roundtable session that Nathan was hosting and moderating, and he'll have some further insights here. But priorities identified there were largely within modeling capacity for these systems in future climate scenarios at the kind of a resolution and with the process physics we need to describe those extremes, and then also to inform attribution. Climate information refers to the observation and modeling systems that we need, not just for extremes, but more generally for, I think, a lot of climate change impact and adaptation activity. So just as you might suspect, the need for high resolution information on a whole range of climate parameters, and also investments in the monitoring observation capacity across the country, and how we frame those with partnerships, especially in Northern Canada. So lots of good discussion and input on those topics. Next slide, please. The last two kind of science themes in that roundtable were, I described them as nexus items: climate water and climate nature. And climate water had a lot of really great input on making sure we don't forget about the oceans here in terms of their role in the climate system and through the carbon cycle, but also in from operational timescales in terms of hydrological and flood forecasts through to seasonal hydrological models and information for water resource management and agriculture, through to longer term climate change water interactions. So lots of need to both work on hydrological models within your system models, but also providing, I guess, more fit for purpose scenarios to drive hydrological models offline. Climate nature, we tried to focus here on what kind of ecological models, for instance, should be the focus within our system modeling and the Earth system science. And there was a separate ecosystems workshop that focused more on climate information needs to inform, say, wildlife management and that kind of thing. But the climate nature was a super interesting discussion on, how can we better inform, for instance, nature-based climate solutions, and it feeds back into the natural carbon cycle, and a lot of maybe more of one of the suggestions was on a better integrated approach for Northern Canada on cryosphere climate carbon, and there's lots of interesting things there we need to dig into a bit more. And I guess as a cross-cutting issue, knowledge synthesis and science communication was discussed, and I'll save a bit more on that till there's a slide which talks about the upcoming workshop on that. So next slide, please, Paul. Just a quick summary of the Resilient Ecosystem workshop, which was held just 2 days, the roundtable, sorry, which was held just 2 days before the Earth Systems Climate Sciences Roundtable. It ran in a similar way, sort of a 4-hour with lots of stakeholder input, lots of university community, but also actually quite a few NGOs and people that work more in this kind of wildlife ecosystem space. And similarly, this is very just early results from kind of things that were discussed and came up in a lot of different breakout groups discussions at their roundtable, but it's maybe what you might expect a little bit, but they really called out the need for sort of a custom fit for purpose information to inform habitat ecosystem modeling, and maybe a bit more a seat at the table with your system climate modeling community in terms of talking about what their information needs are, and maybe sometimes coupling those ecosystem models, but sometimes just getting the right variables to drive ecosystem biodiversity modeling. They identified lots of areas of interest, such as peatland, Arctic Canada, and especially with respect to natural carbon sinks and carbon cycle dynamics. I think I'll leave the rest for this for you to read through and ask about here. As Marjorie pointed out, there's kind of the science programs and what kind of research needs we have. Is it monitoring? Is it modeling? Is it process studies? Is it integration of these? And then kind of informing all that are things like science infrastructure. And this probably came up more cohesively than any other single point at the Earth System Climate Science Roundtable. The kind of challenges we have on these first couple of bullets in terms of the core science infrastructure for observations, the monitoring systems, and in particular, the digital infrastructure and computing capacity. And this won't come to a surprise to ARRCU or the people here, because you've been advancing this and are a real champion in this in terms of thinking about how we can work better across communities. But just to say that it came up over and over again, this kind of structural barrier to working across government and university science and sharing models and collaborating in that modeling space. It was pretty loud and clear, and a lot of comments at that roundtable. And we know it well. We've all had direct experiences working with that and some of the challenges associated with that. That feeds it also into open data, into HQP training and personnel. And from a Government of Canada perspective, being able to invest in those people and work with those people and have that future employee expert pipeline to feed into our workforce, but also it's going both directions here. How can we be better sharing students across government and university science? How can we develop or work with our infrastructure in terms of the observation network, the computing systems, the code systems towards I guess a more open platform and structure to work together. Next slide, please. This, Marjorie made reference to the Science Communication Mobilization Roundtable. It was kind of a cross-cutting theme within Climate Science 2050, such that it was elevated to its own roundtable workshop. We're really happy to have input on these ideas. Many of you have engaged in some of these bullets in your own, I guess, academic lives and your work as atmospheric and climate scientists, ocean scientists. So this is just trying to think about a kind of coherent strategy and some recommendations that might come out in Climate Science 2050 in the National Climate Science Action Plan for, for knowledge synthesis and assessment, for communication materials that help with mis and disinformation, and other questions about what kind of platforms, again, or what kind of innovations do we need within the country to better communicate and mobilize climate science. And pretty wide open, should we be having National Climate Congress every 5 years where we have a lot of this community assembled? Do we have more overt kind of outreach and web resources for people and so on? Next slide, please. Just a couple of slides left. The National Climate Science Action Plan will be putting a lot of what we're hearing into the international context and trying to develop a bit of a map with our international partners. So input to this is really welcome. All of you are working with a lot of international partners. And I think this is something that needs to be, we need to get this right, I think, to understand where we fit in within the international science context, and to be leveraging where possible, and also looking at other countries sometimes for their own national climate science strategies that we might link to and work with. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. This is the next to last slide.
Sorry, did I go too fast?
No, you're just right. Next slide is good, but I was thinking there were, I think I was down to the last one, but there's 2 left. This one is good to talk about a little bit, I think. So I think this is starting into the next steps too. So we're still gathering and we're listening. As Paul said, we're doing lots of consultation, and there's just a lot to sort through, but it's all just towards trying to understand a little bit better what are the big button science questions where national collaboration is going to help, and some investment will help. And within that, I think it's not just what areas of science, and maybe we come up with new networks to address certain high priority areas, but it's also thinking about how do we do better at the coordination and the functionality. And so I think this is on the table, and we really want to hear and think about how can we do this better in the country. And maybe it is the CCAR sort of networks, because those worked really well in lots of ways, but then they're the end and those are done, and then we sometimes end up back in our silos again. So are there other ways and other ideas for how we can work better across the university, government, NGO, Indigenous groups to actually to be more effective on national climate science, not just federal and university and individual climate science programs? Doesn't apply to everything, but where we need those national collectives and collaborations. So thinking just broadly, and I really encourage everyone to give some input and some thought to this. What kind of structural design can really help us in terms of moving forward? Knowing that this is going to be the long haul, right? This is Climate Science 2050. And then how better to get the climate science heard. And listen to and kind of increase awareness, always with the mitigation adaptation users and the policymakers, that science policy dialogue, because often we're seeing huge investment. This is my view. We're seeing huge investments in climate action, and that's needed. Climate services, that's needed, but we often don't have enough investment in the climate science that underlies that, and it's not very sustainable the way it's rolling out right now, because a fairly small group of climate science producers is being asked to do more and more, and we just need to make sure that we're expressing and telling the climate science story and expressing the needs well enough that that can scale with the mitigation and the adaptation efforts across the country. And on this context, there's maybe some things we can learn from COVID in terms of how national coordination and networks have worked. The UCAR model I'm pretty fond of, and not that we're going to develop a Canadian UCAR, but maybe a UCAR light is something worth thinking about as a structure. And now to the last slide, I think. And then we'll turn over, I'll ask Nathan for his input, that things that I maybe didn't capture very well from that Earth System Science Roundtable, and then we can open it up. But moving forward, I think Marjorie shared the timeline. We've got 7 more months where we're gathering input, and we're trying to synthesize this into a set of, I guess, priorities and activities that can really inform the next few years, 5 years of climate science plan for the country. And it's not going to be all climate science in the country. There's going to be lots of other activities that live on and need to be funded outside of that. But let's think about like a few core activities that'll really benefit from a coordinated national efforts that might form the basis of some funding requests and so on. So lots of opportunity to contribute to this through the request for information. We'll be circulating the draft climate science action plan in the spring. So please put to this would be wonderful. I realize there's lots of consultation and input, but this is a chance to shape, I think, the National Climate Science Plan, and your group is pretty core and central to that. So thank you. And not to put you on the spot, but Nathan, anything else you'd like to add would be really welcome, because we know you need to leave at the top of the hour here.
Thanks very much, Sean. Yeah, I thought you did a very good summary of the meeting, which we had in December. And yeah, I'd like to thank again everyone for their input that participated there. I'll just add, as Sean mentioned, I was facilitating the group on extreme, so I can just add a couple of extra points there to the ones that Sean already mentioned. One of them was, and the process, as Sean already said, was kind of very much soliciting input and ideas from the community and from the participants. One idea that was definitely emphasized was the importance of co-development of information on extremes, together with vulnerable communities and the people that are feeling those impacts. And then related to that was the importance of multidisciplinary research in that area, in thinking in terms of working with the research communities that work on the impact side, so that the climate research and the impacts research needs to kind of go hand in hand there. And then lastly, a topic which I think Sean already mentioned was high resolution modeling, as well as high resolution monitoring. There was quite a bit of discussion of that and the extent to which we should, or the relative importance of developing high resolution models versus using existing models to develop parameterizations. But yeah, that's just a few extra topics that came up in that group. And as Sean mentioned, we just got the long report of the whole group, so there's still a lot of work to do to synthesize that before it goes out for comment. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Nathan, Marjorie, anything important I've forgotten or misrepresented there? Feel free to jump back in.
No, I think it all aligns and no surprises. Thanks, Sean. Paul, are you going to moderate the process now?
Yeah, I'll moderate going forward. So I'll make a few remarks. And while I'm talking, this is it's an open Zoom meeting, so that means that everybody can comment and contribute on an equal basis. Maybe the best way to do it would be to send some questions through the chat while I'm just I have a couple of remarks to make of my own. And then we can just take the discussion from there. And this can go on. We've booked an hour and a half, and we don't have to use all the time. But I think that the main purpose of this was informational, to give people a sense of what's going on. And so just in reaction, I just want to point out that the issues you've raised about infrastructure, I think. That is and coordination. I think those are definitely rallying cries within our ARRCU. These needs, and it's the ecosystem of research within Canada still feels quite fragmented. And I hate to try to look at trends. Say that's whether it's getting worse or better. I have no idea, but I do sense that we're just being held back by some fixable problems. Maybe the Climate Science 2050 process can't fix those problems, but I think if we do focus on practical steps to coordinate research and have a predictable path forward for some of the infrastructure, computing, and as well as experimental and field infrastructure, I think that would be a really positive development. That's like from a science, putting on my science hat. I think there was also an action here, which is the second bullet on this slide, related to a request for information. Now, I just wanted to be clear on this because I'm not entirely clear. I received an email, which I think was in the context of my being chair of ARRCU, from the ministry, requesting input. And my understanding of that is that I'm supposed to work with ARRCU, with the ARRCU executive, with the advisory board, to respond to the Climate Science 2050 action plan, and the document and the current kind of roundtables. I was wondering if you could just help me understand how that process is supposed to work. Is it being sent to many investigators, stakeholders kind of across Canada, or is it only being sent to a few people? Because I didn't quite, and maybe it's because I didn't read the email carefully enough, but I didn't quite understand what kind of consultation is being undertaken with this RFI.
Yeah, I can respond to that. We do work with a science advisory group, which means when they give you bright ideas, you need to respond. And one of the first requests we had from our science advisory group was to try and do something similar to the way the Canadian Space Agency and others solicit information from the science community. And that's through a fairly formal RFI process, but not necessarily to individuals, but those groupings of academic communities who can represent a slightly broader perspective and inform our planning process. I think we had almost 100 associations or organizations on that list. It did include ARRCU, but we reached out to the other obvious ones. I had a MEOPAR. We also reached out to the Canadian Association of Psychologists, who run an academic network. We reached out to the Canadian I'm sorry, my mind just went blank. But there's also academic groups that are looking at Indigenous knowledge and infrastructure challenges, housing. So we targeted those other social science communities as well to inform this, because it's very much a definition of science and knowledge that is well beyond natural physical sciences.
Yeah, I understand. And just to make sure, did you send a request out to CMOS and CGU as well?
I will have to check, but I may not have.
Okay.
Thinking about them as more, unfortunately, meteorology, ocean oriented, and kind of heading out towards ARRCU for some of the more climate science, atmospheric stuff. But I will have to double check, and if not, we will also reach out.
No, I'd recommend that, because CMOS certainly, they have strong activities in climate, and ARRCU is part of CMOS, but I think it would be great if CMOS Council could see that. I think they would, that would be a good task for them. They might be able to consult, you know, a slightly different community, but I think they should be. And CGU as well, because of their large hydrology focus. I mean, that would be important. Okay, thanks for that, the answer to that. So it sounds like
Just
I have
add,
homework.
sorry, Paul, I
Yeah.
would just add that even though our date is January 31st, that's when we're going to start analyzing the information. But, you know, adding these other new ones or anyone else critical that comes to mind, we're quite happy to give them, you know, a couple extra weeks and work it in as we go.
This will be necessary because, yes, as I revealed by being by not being quite clear on the process, that means I haven't started on that yet. And so, but I think this meeting is a great opportunity to put our thoughts in order. I think that you know, this will be a topic just that we can handle by email and within the ARRCU advisory board and executive. Okay, thanks. That's all I wanted to say for right now. I mean, I was just, you know, really struck by the sheer volume of information that was exchanged within the roundtable, and like as Sean said, at the day, it was, you know, it did feel like I was sitting in a bit of a brain trust environment. Like, it was really great. It was really, really wonderful, but it's very hard to pull out messages. So I acknowledge the challenge of, you know, pulling all that together. I guess that what I would hope is that coming out of it is not necessarily a set of extremely well-defined topics that, you know, very prescribed topics, but more, you know, and science focuses, but more just a way forward for coordination and you know, a predictable path for how for funding, but also knowledge translation and mobilization that we can kind of point to in future, and so that we don't have to think so hard about the process in future, you know, so that we can get to work on the real problems. Great. Marjorie did say that they did include CMOS, which is fantastic. Okay, so I think this is important for CMOS to jump on as well. Are there any questions? I haven't seen any in the chat, but really be happy to hear from those gathered. Questions of clarification or opinions, comments.
Well, while people think about this, I would just say I'm naively optimistic here. As you know, I'm always like far too optimistic about what's possible and how quickly things can happen. But it is my sense that climate science, the National Climate Science Action Plan, ECCC is the lead on this, but it's really keep reminding ourselves and everyone else that it's national, and many other departments are also involved. So if and when this does go forward to a budget submission around national climate science priorities, it will be coming from a lot of departments, including ICED, and Tri-Council is going to be involved. And I think to me, it's an opportunity to really think about that infrastructure and coordination. And if there's going to be a 30 or, you know, through to 2050 sort of legacy, that might be a really important way where we can think about how can we best mobilize ourselves as a national community to work better, to get out of our silos where those exist. Thanks.
So starting to get some questions, Peter Taylor and then Hélène Côté. So Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question essentially from a university education point of view, in the sense that certainly climate is getting to be a major issue, and extreme weather also becoming a major issue. But I just wonder what the employment opportunities are for our graduates, either at the undergraduate level or at the master's and PhD level, because, you know, I know we're finding a lot of pressure on our program, and the same is true for other departments running atmospheric science degrees. And my graduate students are not finding it easy to find employment. Most of them manage in the end, but certainly there's no clear demand for people with this sort of expertise. And I just wonder what's happening, first of all, within Environment Canada, but also within the industry. I mean, I know some of our people have found positions with Wood Environmental or with the Weather Network and places like that, but the opportunities are very few.
So I can offer an opinion on that, but my crystal ball is not a good one in terms of future employment. I think all of us are looking at issues of capacity. Quite frankly, we do not know the long-term impacts of the pandemic on future federal funding for any programs. And we are very clearly, being asked to balance that and look at essentials and priorities. However, it's been clear to me that not only does Environment Canada, but other science-based departments remain committed to having a core of science experts from which to understand the evolving science in Canada and around the world. It's not a great answer, Peter, but I think that there is another really important perspective here. You said there's no demand for this kind of expertise and I think that I am discovering a huge number of private sector professionals with no understanding of how the atmosphere or the climate system works. And I would hope that some of the people we have trained as climatologists, meteorologists, atmospheric scientists can become part of a broader community and represent science in those other private sector activities moving forward with climate action, sustainable development, etc. I mean, frankly, there are days I am appalled at how little people understand about the environment who are out there trying to take action. So my encouragement is that these are really bright people who come through atmospheric science, earth system science, and I'd love to see them in many different places. So I encourage them to think somewhat imaginatively.
Thanks.
Yeah,
I'd like to move on to
in the insurance business, I guess.
Yeah. I just wanted to move on to make sure that Hélène Côté got a chance because she had a question, and the question, I'll just read it quickly. How do provincial organizations fit in this in Climate Science 2050? Hélène, please feel free to unmute and chat.
Yes. Thanks, Paul. I was wondering, by looking at this presentation, I recognize a lot of stuff that, for instance, Uranus is doing in Quebec for over 20 years now. And I am, I'm not quite sure what kind of coordination or huge plan. How do you see this, and how do you see provincial organizations like Uranus fitting in that plan? It's not quite clear for me.
Thank you. I think there are two parts to this question. The first part is I'll answer is with respect to how are we engaging provincial and territorial governments. We did invite them to be part of the targeted stakeholder survey. We had been having bilaterals with those ministries throughout the development of Climate Science 2050. But for the most part, we're bringing our engagement with the provincial governments through the development of the National Adaptation Strategy. So we are sitting through that process, listening to all the tables that have just concluded to inform the National Adaptation Strategy, and will be part of that provincial territorial engagement going along. In terms of the roles of climate service organizations like yourself, PKIC, some of the new ones that are emerging in the prairies and in the Atlantic region, we will be looking to those groups for experts for some of the science roundtables. They are standard names on our lists when we go out looking for peer reviewers and comments on the documents. So we will be reflecting those opportunities down the road.
Okay, thank you.
Just to add, if I may, that Uranus is actually a really good model. I think more maybe at the provincial scale with your ability to work with as an interface organization and beyond just climate services, but actually with the regional modeling and the work with UCAM. And so I think we can learn something from how Uranus has evolved and been really successful in that space. So your input and advice here, I think is really welcome as well.
My concern is always when it occurs so at the international level, when there's the goal to reach for communities. And from our experience, we already know from all those people that are involved in climate services that when the problems and the solution and the adaptation are very local. So I'm always a bit surprised when international level organization or even national level initiative in a country huge like Canada and with such a wide diversities of climate, it more smaller countries, probably it's not such a big deal, but in such huge territory like in Canada, I'm always a bit puzzled about that, since the needs are so local. So but the building the knowledge behind that, it surely could benefit from joint efforts to address the science behind. But when it's time to transfer the information, that's where I'm a bit puzzled by that.
So climate services will be brought in more actively as we build out on some of the science communication, knowledge mobilization discussions. And we've also been working very, very closely with the Canadian Centre for Climate Services. And I know that they meet with all of the major regional climate services on a regular basis.
Okay.
And I think I have a meeting coming up sometime in January or February, specifically with the climate services organizations. And actually, thank you for your question, because I'd forgotten all about it till now and haven't seen it on my calendar.
It is part of the coordination, because some things do happen at that larger level, like the Earth system modeling capacity and extreme weather information that comes down to the local levels. So it does really require that coordination across scales. So.
Yeah. Thanks.
Let's see, I'm monitoring the chat here. Don't see other questions right now. I would just say that, you know, actually at one of the workshops building up to this report, the one that took place in Ottawa in, oh my gosh, was it 2019? Early 2019. You know, actually it was Denis Bourque at URANOS who talked about the pipeline from, you know, he has a slide that has a pipeline of a knowledge pipeline, right? That starts, for better or for worse, it starts at the science input end and it ends at the user, right? And he also had red lights and green lights to indicate where he thought, from his perspective, you know, things stood in Canada in terms of support. There was a blaring red light over at Basic Research. Okay, Alain Bourque. I'm sorry, Alain Bourque, not Denis. Sorry, Alain. Oh, you can speak to this. No, it's Alain. Sorry about that. Yes, I don't know why I said Denis. Yeah, these are CMOS. Anyway, so Alain Bourque spoke to that issue and just, you know, he pointed out, so it's a whole pipeline and none of us can keep that whole pipeline in our heads. I just don't think it's possible. And so, but Climate Science 2050 seems to be trying to encompass a very large space through the planning. But at some point, you know, I would say ARRCU, I don't want to say where ARRCU sits primarily, but there's a lot more on the upstream end than the downstream generally within this group. But that doesn't mean that a lot of people who get emails from ARRCU aren't very interested in applications. And in fact, quite a few spend a lot of time in on the downstream side. So I don't know. I think it makes the conversation very, very challenging. At some point, I think the scale issue, certainly we can appeal to, you know, international practice for kind of best examples, but Hélène is right. Everything has to be adapted to the context, the Canadian context, as we say, and to the local context. And so that, yeah, that's more of a challenge than we can deal with today. But it's how can we best serve that larger structure is I guess the question for us here. And when we address the RFI, for example, I think we'll have to be careful about our lanes that we can really lay claim to commenting on. That's one of the issues that comes up. As a lot of what you seem to be hearing, Marjorie, is a lot of lack of basic knowledge, but very good subject matter expertise in specific fields, right?
And this happens when we go out and we talk to a more forestry or ecologically oriented community. So it's not a surprise. It's a challenge that we have to build something that provides a chapeau for the broadest range of, and very explicitly, climate change science, not climate science. And I think that I really value some thoughts from a group like ARRCU that has been around for a few years now. It's difficult to imagine a single coordinating entity spanning all of the natural, social, health science related to climate change. But I do wonder if there is a way to create a structure that then enables the satellites, the octopus organizations to exist and continue the really important work specific to each domain and each discipline. But we did find it filled a gap when we held that workshop in 2019, where people lacked structures for the natural science community and say the economists to start to come together or bridge those multidisciplinary topics and nexus areas. So my sense is that we may end up looking more at a national coordinating structure that will really nurture those pieces, but also provide perhaps a place for organizations such as yourselves to hook into when seeking that broader perspective. Like I said, this is very early days, but those are some of the considerations that we're looking at.
Thank you. There's one here's a quick question I can quickly answer. Rebecca, that's a very good point. I was thinking that what we could do is draft so Rebecca asks if the ARRCU executive once it responds to RFI, can members also participate? And I would love anybody's input. Really, ARRCU is not a very, it's a pretty loose structure. So we have an advisory board, but I'd love anybody's input. And I'm happy to share the document that I received with the ARRCU mail list. I think that would be fine, right? It's directed to me, but it's, so that's an action. So in that sense, what I would say is I would expect like it's going to be a couple of weeks late, I think, to get proper input, right? So yeah. And there's a question from Michel Bélan, and Michel, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Paul. The question was in fact addressed to Sean, but it could be Marjorie also. I mean, both made a presentation on the science plan. I guess, Mike, I mean, it's well, you're probably all aware that there are quite a number of centers or countries, if you wish, that are going forward with similar kinds of initiatives, right, for their own populations or greater areas, actually. And so I was wondering if when Sean mentioned the fact that it would be a peer process, right? A peer review process, right? Happening every, say, 5 years or whatever, but clearly at the start. What process exactly will be used to establish the peer review committee or whatever it's called? And will it involve people from other countries, such as, for example, people from NASA or NOAA or UCAR or whatever? It could be also from Australia or from UK or from ECMWF, I mean, whatever, right? There's a number of experts out there that are all working on very similar plans, right? Not just the models, but also the kinds of priorities they want to focus on. In the case of Canada, right, we will have our own sets of priorities. Obviously, they might differ from those of other countries. So that's my question, basically. Has there any thought been given yet on if that peer review process will involve input from outside Canada?
Yeah, and Marjorie may be able to speak to this better than I in terms of the plans and the timing, but certainly it's going to be including we're hoping, international colleagues. We're going to ask for their help and input. I think with respect to the 5-year cycle, it will be this summer, probably, when we've got a kind of a fairly complete draft. Then we will be initially looking for input and feedback on that, and I expect we'll be reaching out then before we kind of finalize this 5-year plan. And then the idea would be to be developing a new, going through that process, this whole process again in 5 years, to revise, update the National Climate Science Plan on that kind of regular basis. And each time would be seeking some international input. And I don't know, it's peer review in terms of really asking for, and we'll be responding to the recommendations we receive. But Marjorie, do you have an idea of the more formal process that we'll be using for that?
So this is soon to reach our science advisory group to help us shape this. Yes, obviously there will be international experts. We're not going to constrain it to Canada. That doesn't make any sense in terms of a peer review, but we will be looking for those kinds of peer reviewers who have some background or experience in looking at these broad multidisciplinary, national planning exercises. And we've also been encouraged to ensure that we tap into other analogs to what Canada is trying to achieve in terms of climate action. And so we have been following analogs in the UK in terms of how they've been structuring their science advice, citizen input type processes to inform climate action there. So we do have some more homework to do to actually develop that peer review process, but the comments and advice from this group are certainly welcome there.
Okay.
It also doesn't need to wait for the peer review process for some things. I mean, this is all really high level, the kinds of things we're talking about so far, so it's hard to really dig into. But if you have some suggestions from an international kind of a strategic plan or document that has similar goals and objectives, then we're really welcome to receive in the early stages as well, so that we can include in our thinking.
Thank you.
I wanted to get back a little bit to Peter Taylor's earlier comment and question about the, about training and graduate student employment opportunities. My initial impression of this activity was also that it was maybe not primarily a focus on internal to the government, but that was a big driver. It was trying to identify capacity gaps within government research labs that needed to be filled in areas such as, for example, something came up a lot in our meetings is permafrost, like research in permafrost, for example. And I was wondering if how much that is still a driver. Is there an explicit focus on within, capacity within the government of Canada across the labs to identify needs? Because there's certainly a relevant role for the academic sector in at least in training the right students. If we know those gaps have been identified, then and there's a predictable path, and we can shift into those areas. I think one of the issues that comes up is it's no longer clear in terms of our own training strategy what we should be preparing students for if they want to get involved with the public sector at the federal level. So I know it's a long question and comment, but just trying to just picking up on things I've heard over the last couple of months, right? Will there be specific recommendations or specific synthesis points that come out of CS 2050 that say government of Canada has seen need for scientists or new recruitment in these areas? I think that would really help us in nationally and in all the universities across Canada.
So this particular exercise is not doing that.
Okay.
But I am aware that there are other departments that are building up capacity in, you just have to put it in their sector context. So agriculture and climate change, forestry and climate change.
Health, climate for sure.
Health and climate change.
Right.
This is not the be all and end all of the planning that needs to be done, but
Right.
it is hopefully going to represent a bit of a national level anchor that can serve as motivation for all these other pieces that need to happen. And I think if we can include enough of a discussion on it being a priority to build science capacity across Canada to continue to inform, that will then hopefully be that hook for other more targeted people planning type exercises. But not this one per se.
Okay. I see a hand up. It's Adam Sobel from Columbia University. Adam, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. So I feel a bit strange saying something. I'm not Canadian. I think I got on the ARRCU mailing list because Paul spent a sabbatical here some time ago and we talked about it. But since the question came up about jobs in the private sector, I just thought I'd offer some perspective. So there's been a long history of scientists with training in our field working in the reinsurance industry, and that's still happening. And I've had a bunch of students go there. And there's actually an event that I somehow got in my email that is a Canadian event, which I will put in the chat in case you all have students who are interested.
The ARRCU mail list, which is extremely useful.
What, this already went to the ARRCU mailing list?
Yeah, I think so. It was Jim Abram who sent it, who's the president of CMOS, who sent it out. The cat.
Okay, wait.
Please go ahead and put it in. Please go ahead.
So that's an reinsurance event. But what I wanted to say is that's been happening for a long time. But the new thing that's happening now is that it's broadened beyond reinsurance. So that there's a whole crop of new companies, startups, and a lot of them are being bought by now by bigger firms doing. One name for it is climate risk analytics or climate data analytics, but it's in response to the fact that a lot of the private sector, and especially the financial industry, either is starting to be regulated to disclose their climate risk, or they think they will be, and nobody quite knows how to compute climate risk. So all these companies are sprouting up to do it, and they're growing really, really fast and hiring a lot of fresh PhDs. And I'm having students leave academia. And even seeing some senior people leave academia to go to these companies. So a lot of the stuff I know is happening mostly in the US and in, maybe in London and other financial capitals, but I'm sure some of it must be happening in Canada too. It's global finance. So anyway, yeah. That's a thing I just thought I'd say. I'll shut up.
Adam, I think that's a really great point. I had a wonderful opportunity to brief the Toronto Investors Group about a year and a half ago. And they really had a very strong message. We need people guiding long-term investments who understand what climate trends and climate extremes and extreme events mean. We need those people who can understand the statistical analysis of the physical environment and relate that to investment risk. And that kind of was behind my comment about the very smart people in atmospheric science who have a lot of these skills that can be picked up in these sectors. So I'm very appreciative you flagged that one.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is it's not just the need that's there, but it's actually happening. I mean, people are doing this and people are getting hired to do it in a big way. At almost every major, the finance is what I'm most aware of, but it's like almost every major financial firm is either starting their own group or buying another one or hiring one to do this. So it's really, and it's still kind of Wild West in terms of how it relates to academia, whether it's, whether it's regulated, how good is the science, what are people really doing? It's all new, but it's a time of rapid growth. And, for people who want to do this, it's a good time to do it.
That's true. I think that space of climate finance is where our students will end up earning far more than we do. I think that's very lucrative opportunities that are really opening up. But another kind of interface position opportunity that I'm seeing a lot of is almost every municipality has a climate office now. That's some people responsible for climate action and their net zero initiatives and so on. And so that there's lots of places where we need these informed climate scientists. But at the same time, I appreciate Paul's push, like where to put the actual science itself and the opportunities there. But.
Right. No, I don't want to be too narrow in my or too biased in this. And I just think that it's good to write down, it wouldn't take much to write down a few identifying capacity limits in current Canadian science and all the areas you're touching on. But we had a whole long discussion on Earth system science, and then there's every topic that we talked about is under resourced in terms of terms of the people who can do it and the people we're training, because there's so much uncertainty. We don't know whether the support is there. So we know the need is there, but we don't know if the support is there. I don't want to belabor that. There was a comment from Hugo Beltrami. Hugo, did you want to unmute, or do you want me to just read it? It was about the peer review and
just go ahead. Just go ahead and read it if you wish.
Okay, yes. So he just suggests not to limit the peer review process for Climate Science 2050 to developed countries or Anglophone countries. There may be some interesting perspectives coming from Africa or Latin America. And I appreciate that point actually a lot, because we're talking about climate impacts and bringing climate change science to those most affected by climate change, and where better to turn for new action plans than to those most affected in many of the countries that are dealing with the effects, maybe in a more direct way or a distinct way from Canada. So I think plus a fresh perspective is always good, then rather than turning to the usual suspects. So, thanks Hugo. Okay, let's see, we're at 4:15. Any other comments? I heard
well, I would, Michel here, Michel Bellon.
Yeah.
Just a quick comment on your question on the kind of capacity that will be sorely needed in the next 5, 10, maybe more years, is if we are to come up with an Earth system model which has the characteristics that would allow it to actually go down to very high resolutions. I mean, we saw numbers of 5, 10 kilometers and stuff like that. And we are aware that the other centers, a number of other centers right now, are going down to 1 kilometer, okay? And so in order to reach that kind of scale for the details with which the climate change impacts will be actually described and evaluated, we will need to have a capacity in informatics that we do not have right now in Canada, I believe. And so it will be very important to find a solution to that, because this is one of the basic tools that will be used, the Earth system models. And they require novel informatics techniques, deep machine learning, that kind of stuff, neural networks, and blah, 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 right? And those are in fact the techniques which are now being looked at in a few other countries. Marjorie mentioned Met Office, ECMWF is one of those. Same as for another major centers. The case is also for the USA with the National Weather Service and NOAA and NASA. And so we don't have right now, I believe, in this country, the capacity to actually do the same kind of approach with our own goal of establishing an Earth system model which will provide the resolution at a level at which we can actually extract impacts and adaptation strategies. And so I guess some might come from universities. I don't have an answer to that, but it has to be one of the major contributions that will be needed. That's just a comment I wanted to make, okay?
So could I add to Michel's comment?
Sure. Yes. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
What I wanted to say is that it's important, the issue that Michel mentioned about going down to 1 kilometer. But to go down to 1 kilometer, it's just right. We need the computing capabilities, but we need the science. We need the science to look at the processes that acted at small scale. And for that, we need measurements from satellite, water vapor, aerosol, cloud formation. So we really need to focus on that as well. So it's not really just a machine, a computer that is going to solve our problems. We need to know the physics. And for that, we need to have some government investment, or at least some kind of support for the actual science that goes on along with that. That's it. Thanks.
Maybe if I could just offer one quick comment, Paul, and to others. This is going to end up being more of a high-level document that we end up with than I think I had originally hoped or imagined in the beginning. It's clear to me that there's going to be a very strong emphasis on improved prediction of climate extremes, extreme events, getting down to those fine scales. I do not expect at the moment that we're going to get into the how should that be done, other than to indicate that this is a priority, and then that there will need to be some further scientific planning, strategic planning, to build all those pieces to get us to those scientific deliverables. And I think, for Sean and I, it's going to be a challenge to figure out how far into the analysis of the how and related pieces if we're identifying critical issues at a much higher strategic level. Because certainly, we have been hearing this not just from the Earth system science community, but others who rely on surveillance tools and the need for finer resolution data, whether it's economic data or population data. There's similar challenges coming up.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just say also quickly to respond. I yes, hear you and understand that very well, what you're saying, and we also heard this at the Earth System Roundtable. So I think I appreciate Marjorie's point that at some point we're identifying gaps in needs, but not necessarily how to get there. And the second point you brought up, Michelle, around use of machine learning and artificial intelligence and how that can be invoked in places like data assimilation and climate analysis is really important. And I think we don't have very broad national capacity in that space. So it's a kind of thing we may be flagging and pointing out, but not actually saying what we need to do in that space, because I don't think that's our place. But we can certainly identify that there's probably a gap here in the coming years. We're already seeing it with NOAA, ECN. We have lots of organizations internationally. We need increased national capacity in this space to inform this, and this, but not and investment in that space would hopefully follow. But we're not maybe going to say what needs to be done in that space. So I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And we had one question hand up from Hélène Côté.
It was more a comment about what Michel and Hugo told about the very high resolution. My point is not to forget that the decision making process must be based on ensemble of climate projections. So it might take a while before we were able to use in kind of a Cordex-like or CMIP-like ensemble at those resolution. So there's room for a few rolling 5-year plans to do so. But be able to, in Canada, I think that the challenge is the density of our observation network to be able to validate the performance of the model. But I agree also with Michel and go in the sense that we have to, I would say, build and protect the diverse Canadian players to provide eventually those kind of simulation into the international ensembles. So the resources, it's going to be a huge challenge in terms of computing capabilities and also storage of those data. And we're already facing those problems in Uranus with hourly archival at 0.11 degrees resolution. So, and our partner in other fields, scientific fields, are often not able to handle these huge amount of data. So there's a room to grow, and a lot of concern that will take a while to address before we will be able to provide those those kind of very we all dream of providing those projection, but the challenge is even bigger than having a single model, being able to produce a reasonable simulation of the climate.
Yeah. So I think I'd like to just check if there are any other further questions at this point.
Can I make a comment on Helene's comments?
Yeah, thanks for the discussion on the resolution, Hélène. And yeah, go ahead. You can maybe just one more.
I fully agree with Helene's comments. In fact, I could have mentioned that. In fact, it is already being tested. The idea is that, yes, we do have coarse resolution observation networks at the surface, right? We all know that. Most of the data in the future will be coming from very high resolution observing satellites, right? And there are plans in Europe and in USA anyway, that those that I know, which are going to be really providing a revolution in the kinds of levels of observations at the surface. And that will have a major impact. There was a question about the science. We need the science also. Well, obviously, to have the science, you need to have the data and the observations to drive it. So it's a mix. We have to understand that this whole structure that will be an Earth system model will be an Earth system model will be a mix of science driven by increased data and observation details, and facilitated in terms of extracting the knowledge of it by having operational systems or Earth systems that are able to actually move fast enough to keep pace with the resolution of the observations as much as the new parameterization, let's call them this way, because we can't go down to the molecular level, obviously. So it's a mix of all those things together that will prove that or show or produce a revolution in our way to tackle these critical issues that we have to face in the next, whatever it is, 20, 30 years. And it's not going to be done in 6 months or 1 year, obviously. We're talking about 10, 15 years at the soonest to get at least a flavor of what can be done. So I agree with what Hélène said. And ensembles will be needed because it provides a way to estimate the accuracy and the probability that an event will happen or will not happen. And that also is a revolution in climate modeling, I believe. So it will be, you know, the future is interesting from the point of view of all the opportunities for the science, okay, in climate modeling and Earth system modeling to provide quite original and challenging results, in my view. I'm trying to be optimistic, okay?
We have to be optimistic for sure. Well, thanks, Hélène and Michelle for that. Oh, and William has a, so we'll have to take one more question or comment from William Ward. Go ahead, William.
Okay, just a quick one. I just, Marjorie's comment about not including anything on capabilities. I just was a bit curious what exactly was meant there, because it seems to me that the teeth of this would be at least to point to capabilities that might be needed, as opposed to essentially solving them. But I think that without pointing to some capabilities that the community would need to develop, then you're not giving direction to the powers that be to sort of think about what resources might be needed.
I think some of that conversation is going to come out when we work with the granting councils and look at what some of our recommendations around future investments should be, because it will, as you say, have to kind of look at existing capacity and gaps, but it is sort of a step beyond our first goal with this first National Climate Change Science Plan. But it is, you know, all pieces that I'm hoping will be rolled into the evolution of this over a much longer time frame, and really sort of institutionalizing the need for this kind of planning on a regular basis. It was quite remarkable to discover that the Pan-Canadian Framework for Clean Growth and Climate Change in 2016, and again, the Strength and Climate Plan that was just released by the federal government, did not recognize or provide space for building and refining and evolving the knowledge base to keep feeding and evaluating climate action. And I think our very first step is to fill that gap. And from there, these other pieces need to start to emerging. But we are starting from scratch with this exercise.
Okay, thanks.
Starting from scratch, and that's well. Let's hope that we can avoid starting from scratch again, and just right.
Exactly.
And so we have to keep, you know, whatever happens, we have to sort of keep on the working on making sure that these plans lead somewhere, and we retain the memory as well. Anyway, so I somehow inadvertently stopped sharing screen, but that's fine, because I'd like to bring the meeting to a close today. There was one more hand up, I think, or one more comment related to observations in the observational network. Marco, I think I'll have to take that offline, because I think we've had a good discussion so far, and there are fewer people online now. So, but maybe, yes, go ahead. Okay, go ahead, Marjorie, if you want to tackle that one.
So please do follow it up offline. This hasn't come up yet. It didn't come up in a really emphatic way in our first science roundtable, but please be a little bit precise. Observations of what?
Precipitation.
Cryosphere, atmospheric composition,
meteorological observations,
climate parameters.
That's right.
That's all.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, very good. So thanks everyone for joining. It was a really great discussion, and thanks so much, Marjorie and Sean and Nathan, who signed off for leading this discussion. And we have some homework, and look forward to hearing what the next steps are with Climate Science 2050. Thanks very much. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you. We
Thanks
appreciate
for
all your
hosting.
input.
Yeah.